This week we're going to cover models and user and usage. So specifically modeling. Now modeling can describe how we can prepare our project. Basically we're going to be working toward the numerous types of models that are available in the UX wheel process, but we're prepping to get to a point where we can create a hierarchical task inventory, which is the deliverable for this week. So let's get started.
As you can tell from the slide, we're now adding the design informing models to our wheel process. This is where we'll be creating interaction design concepts. And finally, for the designers in the class, your ideas will begin to take shape.
So what do we mean by modeling, and how does it find its place in a user experience course? Well, we can say that it sounds very theoretical and academic, but it's really quite simple. Modeling simply means a way to organize and visualize your user research data. It also means you're giving meaning to raw data. So subtle comments from interviews with users, we need to interpret that here and model it into something we can digest and utilize. Lastly, modeling is what we use to inform design, which is why we see it at the top left part of the wheel. So what does the word abstraction mean? When we use models as abstractions, it sounds confusing. But really it's an abstraction because we're trying to get through all the clutter of all the many comments and criticisms and data points that we have from our contextual inquiry down to an essence element. We want to know what all the comments and interviews mean at the end. So we're trying to extract everything that's important into something we can use. So I like the term an immersive mental framework because it is that. We want to have our minds weed out the subtle comments that could be, fueled from anger, which we discussed in week 1, into something that we can use. What can we use to make our product better or to utilize in the development of our product? So when we use models, we want to turn all of our usage research data into actionable items for design. And that's why the word abstract comes in. We want to step away from the model and understand the important points that came from our contextual inquiry. Furthermore, we have to trust that our models will inform UX design. We want to make sure that it uses structured representations to inform our UX design. So that term structured representations is key. How do we get our data from all the many comments from our contextual inquiry into something that can be trusted and utilized? Also, each model will need to give a different perspective into the overall picture of a work practice. So we're going to be doing a lot of grouping and a lot of organizing to make sure that each model or modeling has a unique perspective. So we're going to end up seeing a lot of data points going into one model and another data point going into another model. Think ecological and interpersonal. Think of the things we've done so far in this course. Again, just like the WAAD, we need to group, we need to organize, and then we can model, and that is what would inform the UX design. Now, much like the processes of the UX wheel, not all models are always needed. Some models you may want to disperse with just because they don't provide a return on investment. But the most commonly needed data models that we use are generally user work roles and a flow model. These are used for almost all projects because the work roles are very important in identifying who's going to be interacting with your product. And the flow model is going to discuss and describe how the user will flow through the product that you're making. And this doesn't matter if it's a physical product or a digital product. These two categories are very important for modeling our data so that they can inform UX design. I'm going to say that for a lot of these slides. Remember, the whole point of this is our models need to inform user experience design. To further describe modeling, we need to understand that models are not only for users, but they're also for task structure. Remember that word task, because later on in this lesson and in this week's content, we're going to ask you to do a hierarchical task inventory. We want to know what tasks are necessary for our product and what people will need to do to utilize our product. So I want you to consider, if there is a broad range of user characteristics for any work role, consider making it a user persona. And I mean a candidate user persona, not a primary. We'll get to the idea of user personas in a week. But for now, just consider if there's any broad range of user characteristics that would fuel your persona. Also, consider organizing. If there is a large number of user tasks, organize them with a task structure model, such as the HTI. And lastly, describe. If some user tasks are a bit complex, describe them with task sequence models. So this is all part of Chapter 9 of this text. But the idea is looking at data, organizing it by similarities and commonalities, and then describing anything that's complicated. Now, let's talk about if our research data has artifacts, physical environment information, or just random information in general. Those models are something that needs to be not only organized, but categorized. So if the work practice involves many artifacts, describe them with an artifact model. This is one of the many models we'll talk about this week. If the work practice is influenced by physical layout, describe that with a physical work environment model. So basically, if you have to describe the environment with which someone works, think air traffic controller. They might have, a desk that has 3 monitors, similar to a developer. That would be described with a physical work environment model. Now, lastly, if the data and information the users need to store, retrieve, display, and manipulate are complicated, represent it with an information architecture model. So we've got an artifact model, we've got a physical work environment model, and we've got an information architecture model. Those are 3 distinct categories of modeling that we can do that, again, and let's tie this back to the whole lesson, feed UX design. Once you've accrued your user research data, it's a wise idea to start modeling early. Before you begin anything at the top of the wheel, design, for example, modeling should be well established. So what we need right from the beginning is the user work role model, the flow model, and any task model. So if we think about an air traffic controller, right, we've got what their jobs are, what the requirements are, the user work role model. Then we have the flow model, what they do in a given day. Then we can break it down to the specific tasks, which are the task models. Once we have those models, we can kind of develop a persona. And from there, we can start to satisfy that persona with our product. But I would recommend that you continue to build these models as you encounter them in data elicitation. So basically, modeling is something that can happen during user research. And here I have a point, post user roles in your design studio. So once you come up with them, you don't want to forget them. So you might write them on a Post-it so it categorizes. I've said this in this course. I do this very digitally. I'm not a Post-it guy. I fear that the Post-it will fall. But with digital, I can trust it. So I definitely usually, if I'm doing the complete process, would list user work roles. Now this is, how's this going to apply to you? Well, I applied it for my data-driven mobile apps. And that's kind of where I've used this process the most, the user research modeling, to see what happened. And guess what? This whole process resulted in something great, because I got complaints from my salesmen for whom I was developing these apps that their internet was really shoddy around the Rocky Mountains, where a lot of their clientele was. That forced me to think about ways I could figure out their internet connection and sync up the data when the internet was strong. So just like the previous slide, I really want to reiterate that we want to overlap modeling with the data elicitation. So any kind of thing when you're collecting data that you want to write down about modeling, do it right away. Early research data elicitation and analysis helps fill in gaps and refine concepts. If we're constantly thinking about modeling when we're doing contextual inquiry, we're going to be able to make it more effective. So as soon as you observe information about any workflow or any information flow or work role, make sure you sketch it out, make sure you write it down, and if you are still on the client site, get confirmation from the client and users. So basically, I'll narrow that down. Any stakeholder, run it by them if you think there's a model. And this is why this course is called Agile again. Agile development and Agile management really involves iterative feedback loops that involve the client. The client is involved more with Agile than any other work methodology. So when you might see this in our slides throughout the course and the lecture and the reading, because we're involving the client here. So if you have data, you could reach out to the client and ask them to add a little more information if they know it. Because if you see a user model or user work role that didn't previously exist, you could run a check by the client. The client would know. So this is really effective in redesigns. I mean, with new products, the client may not know much. It's just an idea, a dream, and it's up to you to define those work roles. But by involving the client in a redesign, chances are they'll know. And they might have access to analytics that you don't. So that kind of communication is huge. Point being, you collect data. If you have any modeling potential at that point, use it. So as you move forward with data analysis after the data is collected, understand that this later analysis and modeling is for confirming points and answering questions. So as you enter the top of the wheel, you're going to want to possibly override previous preconceived notions of what a model was or a user work role was. So by overlapping not only modeling with user research but also data analysis, you can really bring clarity to what the point of your project is. So I like this line here. While distilling raw usage, research data into work activity notes, as you see a note relating to models, merge them into the appropriate models. I can do this digitally. You'll see it a lot in the book and videos if you YouTube it, that where people have posted to just move them around. Well, we can do the same thing with Axure. So you merge it into the appropriate model, basically if data analysis tells you to. And the example here is adding a new user work role or task to a corresponding list. Or you can set it aside as an input to modeling, on the side. This is very similar to what we did with the WAAD. You organize, you categorize, you change things, you add to things, you extend on things, and eventually, through iterative feedback, you get the right tasks, you get the right affinity diagram.
Our goal for this segment of the project is to leave analysis, deductive reasoning, and things like that, and go to create ideas on paper that drive, inform, and inspire the design. Nothing we build in this phase generally appears directly in the design, but we'll often see offshoots or manipulations of the elements placed in the design informing models that do find their way into the final design. So we'll be focusing on the elements from the diagram, the affinity work diagram, that can be turned into design-oriented construction. Things like task descriptions, user personas, things that were derived from the early analysis stage, things that can be turned into actionable items to guide design. It could be navigation items. It could be things like menus. Elements to consider or take into account in design will be focused on from those diagrams and from those brainstorming sessions and from the notes. When we create a user model, we'll focus on work roles, much of which was done during the extraction analysis process. Now it's time to focus on sub-roles, alternate users that might be interacting with the product we're creating. In the example of the ticket agency, the example might be a student, alumni, general public. Those are sub-roles with a little bit more specific descriptions. Also, we'll be focusing on mediated work roles. These are people who do not directly interact with the system, with the interface. So in the case of a ticket buyer, it might be a ticket agent on the other side, or the person who creates the seating requirements or things like that, or assigns prices to seating. Those are all mediated work roles that are not direct system users but need to be considered.
So defining work roles and sub-roles are vital to what we're trying to achieve here with our modeling. We don't want to focus on a person, only their job. We don't want to, that's the persona. We want to make sure that the job is what the focus is. So air traffic controllers, it's not about a 55-year-old bald guy who's overworked and overstressed like is portrayed in the movies. But it's a job. The job is to control aircraft and to do it properly and safely. So again, it's defined by a kind of work and work responsibility. In the Mutt's case in the book, ticket seller, event manager. And multiple people can play the same role. You know, if you have a blank bank teller, you could be anything. You could be age 17 to 100. You could be any gender, anything. You could be whatever. So that's important. Now, sub-roles are important too. Remember, we're trying to focus on all stakeholders. So the work roles are the people directly working with it. But a sub-role might be a ticket buyer, a student ticket buyer, an alumni ticket buyer, a general public ticket buyer. That's a stakeholder in the Mutt system. Although it's not a work role, it's a participant. And that's a sub-role that must be considered if we're going to be thorough. So sub-roles are kind of like mediated work roles, but different. If we think about the ticket buyer, he's not a direct system user if he asks the ticket seller to use the system to help him buy tickets. That's a mediated work role. It's even less of a work role than a sub-role where the ticket buyer may use the kiosk to buy the ticket. So if the ticket buyer becomes a direct user in the new ticket kiosk system, then he's no longer mediated. So that's a big thing. A big difference. We have to consider those people too, because we have to consider the break in communication if someone's asking a seller to actually use the kiosk system for them. So let's examine the work roles in the Mutt system. The ticket seller uses the system on behalf of the ticket buyer, just like Ticketmaster. The ticket buyer is an indirect user who goes up to the little booth and asks the ticket seller to use that system on behalf of him or her. The event manager interacts with event sponsors and venue managers to make sure that that event is listed in the system so that tickets can be sold. Then we have other stakeholders most people don't think about. The advertising manager, who interacts with outside sponsors for advertising and needs to communicate with those advertisers where the person can get tickets. And even the financial administrator, who's responsible for accounting and credit card issues that may go awry when someone is interacting with the kiosk system, whether it be the ticket seller or the ticket buyer directly or indirectly through the ticket seller.
A thorough analysis and a thorough user model could have many offshoots of the workflow. Here, we see a specific workflow, a task set that has major activities performed for their own work responsibilities, also a user class, which defines the characteristics of the people who take on that role, and that gets passed into the flow model node. So if I were a ticket agent, I would list my activities that I need to do, the type of person I am, how I would interact with something, and that would be passed on into a flow model node. So briefly, a little bit more about the user classes. In our previous slide, we discussed the characteristics of the type of user that might assume a work role. In this case, it would be the knowledge and skills-based characteristics, what kind of experiences they came in with. Generally, a ticket agent would have some computer skills, for example. Even physiological characteristics are important. How often do they sit at a desk all day? Do they get up at all? Also, what sort of experience is necessary to become a ticket agent? These characteristics can help us define how the user will interact with the product. Do they need an ergonomic keyboard? Issues like that can be decided upon by looking at those three types of characteristics. A more specific example of a user class could be a public ticket buyer for the ticket kiosk system that's mentioned in the book. This could be senior citizens, anybody who needs public transportation. That person could have limited motor skills and some visual impairment. So we'll need to accommodate them, and the kiosk screen will have to have large text. Some common elements of user class models are indented lines and descriptions of barriers. In your model, what you might see is a red block N followed by a description of the need. So the need might be something like large text for a senior citizen user of the ticket kiosk. And a lightning bolt would define a barrier, something that could impact or impede the necessary requirement. So a red lightning bolt might appear over the limitation of the screen size. So if I need exceptionally high text and I have a small screen size, well, there's a limit to the amount of text that I can put on that screen, and that would indicate a barrier. One type of user model is called a social model. In it, we can describe the communal aspects of the workplace, of the environment, of the worker who's interacting with the software or the product that we're designing. So the things we'll have to consider when creating a social model for that user are the environmental factors of the workplace, the culture of the workplace, its philosophy or ambiance, the norms of behavior. Is it relaxed? Is it stressful? What are the influence, attitudes, and pressures on that workplace? And it's not an indictment of the workplace itself. It is a factual analysis of what goes on. If we were to look at an air traffic controller workplace, for example, it's natural for it to have stress. We're not saying that the management of that environment is not doing well. It's just a fact that goes on behind that. In the case of a ticket agent, you can expect it to be somewhat busy on event days and somewhat slow on non-event days. But the pressures will be varying, in other words. So we're looking at the concerns of individuals in their specific workflows. What do they feel? What are their attitudes? What is their mindset? Do they feel pressure, not pressure? If they feel pressured, the interface had better be even easier to make a lot of work done fast. So there's a lot of things that can come out of a good social model. This is a good example of a social model diagram as presented by our text. In it, we see the various entities involved in a presentation. We see a local audience, a remote audience, two different audiences that might want to see the presentation, but maybe have different work domain constraints. So the conditions of the presenter are obvious. They might be a little nervous. Their intentions are good because they are presenting. They don't want to look bad in front of anybody, so they have their own work domain restraints. But look at the difference of the domain constraints of a local audience compared with a remote audience when viewing the same presentation. Collectively, they all want to learn something, and they want to ask questions. The local audience feels trapped. If they get bored, they can't get up and leave. What will people think if they go to the restroom? The remote audience, however, is basically worried that they might miss something that only the local audience gets. Two very different entities undergoing the same work type constraints, and yet subtly different. In this case, we'd need a social model diagram to basically document the difference of the people who are interacting with the presenter. We can expand our social model diagram by representing the relationship by each of the three unique entities in our social model diagram of a presentation. This is a great graphic that talks about all the interaction possible between the audience members. We've got nervous demeanor, reminder to slow down, speak up, and enunciate. That's for the local. For the remote, we've got other things. We've got the ability to answer questions when the presenter can't hear questions. So there's numerous factors going into this model, and they all affect how whatever product we want to create for our presenter would be designed. In other words, let's say we wanted to allow our remote audience to ask questions. Well, blog software would have to be added to the visual presentation of however it was initially broadcast. So these things can get very, very sophisticated and complicated. And as we mentioned in the first 3 lessons, a lot of times it's based off the complexity of the work domain.
So another type of model that could be made off of user research is an artifact model. This is a collection of artifacts used in the work practice. And of course it's collected in the data elicitation, but data accrual basically. So these can include more than what I'm listing here, but work practice forms like order forms, because we want to see what a user would fill out to create an order. Any kind of props, property, any kind of receipts, memos, correspondence forms, or templates for work products. How does the user work if they use a form? That's an artifact, and it could be other things too. This is quite frankly a very small list. Let's look at an example. So let's talk about these work artifacts. In this case, on the right side, you see a simple wait person's order. And you see shorthand, so that tells us a lot. We see the actual bill receipt stapled onto it. These are examples that include paper memos, email messages, correspondence templates, product change orders, and other things people create and use while working. So I like the idea of the air traffic controller. I reuse this all the time because I want to know what emails go back and forth between the manager and that air traffic controller. I know that's tough information to get, but if you can get a hold of that, you get a good idea of complaints back and forth. So what you can do is go to the manager and ask for those emails. What's the matter with the ATCs? What are they complaining about? Huge, great data there. And here, an example, an order form being filled out that reveal traces of people's work practices. We have some sketchy handwriting here. I see bacon 369. I think it's an omelet, an app, WW Dry, so maybe wheat toast. I don't know what cham is, 2 grits, BS. I have no idea what this is. On the right, we see half gravy, full gravy, juice, drink, and that's it. So, how does one thing translate to the other? That's what I want to see to learn. And what mistakes can happen when that wait person, writes this down. I think 2 eggs scrambled soft, that makes sense, with grits and whatever system they have. So we've got 2 breakfasts on the left, I think, but I still haven't nailed it. I know there's 2 coffees at the bottom, but I find this work fascinating, seeing what is here, and how the bill was calculated. So the last point is showing how tangible elements, physical electronics, are used and structured in business process flow of doing work. So in a diner, for example, you have this, and do you think this is open for error? I would think so. This seems very, very open for error. Let's just put it that way, the way this is written, because you have numerous wait persons in a diner. You have numerous cooks. Where is their cheat sheet? I want to know how they're, defining these things. But I love this slide because it shows you how important work artifacts are. And that if you can get access to this kind of information, including emails from an air traffic controller to his boss, it's solid gold for your ability to create a good product. So when creating an artifact model, add your own notes about the model itself. Any thoughts you have about, the check that I just showed you from the diner? I want you to imagine a detective's board. If you've ever seen serial killers on a map where they have little nails and little string that goes from area to area. Imagine that board posted with artifacts relevant to a case or your case. And that's huge. So annotations, arrows, anything you want. The artifact model really needs to have a brainstorm of ideas from all the information you gathered, because that information is incredibly precious and you don't want to lose it. More on the artifact model. So usage research teams must pay close attention to how these artifacts are created, communicated, and used. When the team looks at it, they're going to ask, what are those notes scribbled on those forms? You have to be ready to explain those notes, and they should be legible. And Also, why are any fields left blank? Why are fields full? Why is there a sticky note on a form? Anything that might not be clear needs to be clarified in the artifact model. Otherwise, the artifact itself is useless. So maybe there's a signature that's required for approval on other kinds of documents. You need to get that. If there's access to elements in a privacy organization where they have a non-disclosure agreement, you need to get access to that because that's huge. I mean, you just heard me 2 slides ago talk about how valuable emails are from an ATC to a manager. If a manager can't just turn that over, he has to go to the employee and ask if it's okay. But it's all for the greater good to get a good, better software product. So much like the WAAD and even the HTI this week, we want to make artifact posters. So what we'll do with this poster is attach samples of each artifact to a separate flip chart page. Now, before I even talk about annotating with stick-on notes, as you've probably heard in my first few lectures, I think digital is the way to go in 2020. So don't be afraid to scan these artifacts and do it digitally still. To move the bar of this entire field forward, I do believe we need to deviate away from the physical product of a poster. Yes, there's an argument that the poster is shareable in the office, but what about people who work from home? What about the COVID, quarantine? We can do everything that I talk about in this course digitally. I guarantee it. All it takes is a scanner to scan these notes and then just drag them onto a screen. That's it. But at the same time, we can complete what this slide calls for. We can attach samples of each artifact to a separate flip chart page digitally. We can annotate stick-on notes. Heck, Axure, XD, Figma, all these softwares have annotation devices in it. Now, we need everything to be central to immersion in the subject domain. So once we see artifacts deviate away from our main goal of our product, it's time to kind of trash those. We can hold them on the side for later in case the project changed, but we do want to stay on track. Also, keep any tangible talking points for analysis and design. If you make this poster and you throw artifacts up that once made sense to you and doesn't make sense anymore, put it back up. Put a little post-it next to it, even digitally, that says, hey, let's talk about this. This was important at one time. I forget what it was. Does anyone know? And then you can share it digitally with everyone in the team. I hope that makes sense. I'm talking a little bit. I know this book was just released in 2020, and I'm talking ahead of it because this book was released before COVID. And I want to make sure that you understand that you can be one of the movers and shakers that change this industry to go all digital for these kinds of processes. Now let's leave the artifact model and talk about the flow model. This is where we get a bird's eye view of the entire workflow from start to finish, and that's why we call it flow. Where's the user? Where is he going next? He or she going next? And the scope is the entire work practice for a flow model, start to beginning. We also want nodes for active entities, any work roles, and a central database for all of these active entities. So anything that interacts with our product, we want to know about. That's the flow. So arcs for flow of work, information, non-computer communication flow, such as via email, telephone, and artifacts, are all part of the flow model. Everything that goes into the user's interaction with whatever we're producing becomes a part of the flow model because we want to know everything the user does. In the next slide, I'll show you an example flow model.
This is an envisioned flow model for the kiosk that's discussed in our text. Here you can see how thorough it gets. Numerous entities and numerous types of software. We've got extensions down to advertisers, ad groups, venue managers, customers, web users, and you see the number of physical entities documented, including the web server application, the kiosk application software, the database itself, all the software that covers those user entities, including event management, marketing, database maintenance. These things can get very thorough and complicated, but it's good because it keeps all these elements within our radar when we design the specific product we need to work through. Now for a little bit of terminology and a discussion of the difference between tasks and functions. Tasks need to be documented as something a user does. whereas a function is something that the system does. So the example in the book is how in our kiosk information will be displayed and viewed. The function is the system's displaying the data. The task would be the user typing in the data or the user reading the data off the monitor. We've been through a social model. We've covered a usage model. What about a task structure model? In this case, we need a hierarchical task inventory where we'd list our tasks and break them into subtasks and steps. It's a functional decomposition in the software hierarchy. We need to know what tasks are currently used and what could be achievable or possible given our project resources. A hierarchical task inventory is important because it helps to guide the overall design. We basically can use it as a checklist. It's a list, and it's also a priority list, so we can keep track of our task coverage in the design phase of the wheel. For matching that coverage to our inventory of scenarios and other task representations, we can compare our checklist to see how we're doing in the production of the design model.
So a hierarchical task inventory does not represent temporal ordering. That means that if you have a task, like a checkout, that has, enter phone first name, enter last name, enter address information, that is not temporal because the user could enter the address before the name. So those should not be top to bottom. They should be side by side because they're all part of the same process. I would ask that you not only look through this presentation, look at my examples that are posted in the course, and see the book for rules and guidelines for creating an HTI diagram. It's really important. This is definitely about processes and not so much the order of the process. So in a few slides, we'll show you an example of the HTI for the MUTs. Follow that one distinctly and you'll do well. When creating a hierarchical task inventory, we start by considering relationships. If we have a couple of tasks, and if one of the tasks is a super task or a head task or a parent task of task B, we need to put it above B. If B is a subtask of A, we need to put it below. Now, what does this mean? Well, it could be buying a product, something like that, where A is buying a product and a subtask is the checkout. B would be part of A, but below it. With hierarchical tasks, you want to make sure you avoid temporal relationships and sequencing. This means that the subtasks or supertasks need to be dependent on the initial task. In the image you see here, the drive car is the action. In order to drive a car, sure, we need to start an engine, but we don't need to select gear as part of starting the engine. The select gear should be on the same horizontal level. The horizontal gear, selecting the gear is not dependent on starting the engine. So even though they come temporally in sequence, the fact is that they're different actions, and that's a big part of hierarchical relationships. If we have driving the car, we have the many things that are part of driving a car on that same horizontal line. However, they can't be dependent on each other. We always put, as we saw in a previous slide, tasks above themselves when they are dependent, when they're super tasks or subtasks. So hierarchical task inventories are intended to guide the overall design because we'll know the workflow based on the tasks in their hierarchy. We can do primary tasks, subtasks, and that would determine how we can design. It's definitely a focal point because now we understand how the user flow will work. We can also use HTIs as a checklist for keeping track of task coverage and design. Is every task covered? Is it built into the system? That's a huge thing. We can't just assume that we can just build a product without understanding every task that the user needs to achieve their goal for visiting our product. Lastly, HTIs are for matching that coverage to your inventory of scenarios and other task representations. So when we think about user scenarios and even use cases, which we'll be doing in a couple of weeks, this is going to feel that. So the HTI for whatever your project might be is going to feel all sorts of task representations. If someone is going to a YouTube, for example, they might be going for numerous things. They could be publishing a video. They could be viewing a video. They could be reviewing a video. There's a lot of different tasks in a standard video site. That's the same for most sites. We go to eBay, for example. We might sell something. We might buy something. We might rate something. We might just shop for something. So those are all tasks. And each one of those needs to be represented. So because a full HTI can be too large to handle and offers too much data, the idea is to try separating it by user work roles. Tasks performed by one work role are usually separate from those of other work roles. So the idea is to first make a first level of your HTI and separate it by work roles, which we will see in the following slide. But the idea is that we can do analysis and design for each user work role separately. So if we have a system and we have different work roles, we can separate the tasks for each work role. Here you see a system, tasks for work role 1, work role 2, work role 3, n being any number. So this could be as many work roles as you can define, but this is the best way to create your HTI. This is an example of a first level hierarchical task inventory for our MUT system. We do this at the beginning to figure out the main tasks and user work roles. So there's manage ticket service, which is the GM basically, manage finances, manage the database, sell tickets, manage events, manage advertising. Basically money, storage, the actual interpersonal task of selling, control of the events, and control of advertising. 5 distinct user roles here. And that's how we can start our HTI. Once we have those user roles determined, we can progress. In this case, we're looking for the sell tickets process. You see the line that goes down from the sell tickets box. And what we're doing is determining ticket buyers' needs, finding tickets to match buyers' needs, selecting an event, find seats to match buyers' needs, provide directions, provide event information reviews, make the sale. Notice that even though make sale is at the end, it's not temporal. It doesn't need to be below the other things. They're all part of the same thing, which is selling tickets. They're all related to each other. And that's an important point in this, since we're going to be doing this for an assignment. Again, go back a couple slides for the temporal explanation. Even though make sale comes at the end, it's all related to the same thing, selling tickets. Now also notice that every single box here, every single one, has a verb at the beginning. They're all tasks. We should see no objects in your HTIs. This is a distinct user role. And that's what's beautiful about it. You don't see anything like, checkout page. That's an object. Checkout page would be an object. That's not a task. So generally when I grade these things, I look for the verbs and I look for that temporal requirement, that things are related to each other, even if they come after. So if we look at the temporal part of this, find seats to match buyers' needs, then we can go down another level, view the venue, view the seating, and select specific details, all related to the same thing, getting the person the seat they want. So each row here is related to the same task, even if there is an order or temporal time of that section. I mean, you go down to find tickets to match buyers' needs on the left. Filter events, browse events, search events. Those are the same. They're on the same level. And only when we need to use parameters do we go one level down. The same thing on the enter credit card information. Swipe card, enter expiration code, enter security code, enter amount. Those are on the same level because they may be in a temporal order, but they shouldn't be in a task inventory because they're all related to the same process of entering credit card info. This is really important.
In yet another very good example from the text, this is a hierarchical task inventory for the transit system. As we scroll down, we see the Manage Ticket Service as the highest node. Below that, we see the Manager categories. Below that, we see subgroups, basically determining ticket buyers' needs, selecting events, kind of a flow model for user tasks. This is how we can basically prioritize and organize all the things that we need to do for the system. It is the hierarchical task inventory in the past couple of slides that would lead us to creating the task model. Basically, we'll have these usage scenarios as narrative task interaction models. We're looking at people, activities, work situations. We're going to tell it as a narrative, and it's almost like a transcript of the flow of a real usage occurrence. We will describe in layman's terms what this usage scenario is. The usage scenarios will cover a wide expanse of time. They'll be informal, fragmented stories, open-ended, and they'll tell the story of the user in different scenarios. So with the scenario defined, Friday afternoon before a big weekend, we've labeled where we are, who the parties are. Now the ticket seller. She looks through her computer listings of movies, concerts, plays, fairs, carnivals, special events, talks to the group about their options, and the group decides on a concert. This is an example usage scenario from the project described in the book, the transit service. John and some friends plan an evening together out on a weekend. So initially we see the time frame, the weekend. They agree to meet at the ticket window on Friday afternoon. Further, more time expanse descriptors. Some walk to the transit, others take the bus. Well, with the work week behind them, everybody's happy, looking for entertainment. They check out the events for Saturday night. After waiting in line, John asks the ticket seller what kinds of events have tickets available for Saturday night. So there's a scenario that covers the story of the person. It's an informal narrative, and it covers the expanse of time. Friday afternoon, the excitement about the weekend. That's a good usage scenario. Now we get into a more descriptive part of the usage scenario. The ticket seller asks, what kind of concert? Classic? Pop? The group goes with a pop concert. Ticket seller tells them their options. They decide on a concert playing at a certain area, a certain venue. Now, this is what's a good example of a descriptor. Some unease within the group because they feel the ticket seller did not give them enough information to make the best choice. They felt like they were hurried. Now, what is it about that interface that will make them hurry? That's a deductive process that will have to occur later. But let's continue with our usage scenario. So the group asks about the seats. The ticket seller has to return to her computer and bring up a graphic seat map. The tickets the seller has on hand are only for a subset of seats actually available, forcing the group to pick from these, knowing they had not seen all the real options. We've all been through that scenario where you feel rushed in a line and you're choosing seats for a certain event, and that person seems to offer you the seats that they want to sell instead of the seats that would make you the most happy. So the group in this case chooses the seats based on price and seat location. And the ticket seller requests an option to buy the tickets, locking out others until the transaction is either completed or given up, which is positive. And let's continue with this scenario. So in closing this usage scenario, the group agrees to purchase the tickets. Now they have to discuss how they're going to pay. They decide to give John, the buyer, cash, and he'll pay on his credit card. So John swipes his credit card through the slot in the counter. The transaction's authorized, sale committed, the ticket seller gives them the tickets. The group is happy, but they leave with a nagging feeling they missed out on something, like they didn't get the best bang for their buck, partially because they were rushed, or felt rushed. Another type of usage model is a step-by-step task interaction model. This usually contains detailed descriptions of tasks, as observed in users or as how the users describe them. And in this case, we would just show detailed steps of the task performance, but would also include the timing, the temporal ordering of the actions and activities.